We're approaching 3 months since Joe Biden gave up on his bid for re-election and Kamala Harris's presidential campaign began. And I was very surprised that Biden was able to put his ego aside and step aside, and I was glad that we were finally getting at least a semi-fresh face in this presidential race. But make no mistake, it's not like I've ever been super enthused about Kamala Harris as a candidate. I wasn't a fan of her 2020 campaign, where she dropped out even before Iowa. She's a flip-flopper at Medicare for All. Back when she was a senator in California, she backed Bernie Sanders' bill, the Medicare for All Act of 2017. The aim of the bill was to abolish private health insurance and replace it with a single-payer, government-run system. Obviously, a bill like that would have no shot in hell of passing the Senate, but even if by some miracle it did pass both the House and the Senate, Trump was president at the time. Trump would have 1000% vetoed that had it reached his desk, but at the time she aligned herself with such a position. During her first presidential bid, she began to wean off that position. Whenever she would be asked if she would abolish private health insurance, she would be very hesitant to answer the question. Her policy proposal that was essentially her version of Medicare for All wasn't actually Medicare for All, but rather just an expansion of the already existing and for-profit Medicare Advantage. During her tenure as Attorney General in California, she did not like the idea of releasing more prisoners, even after the U.S. Supreme Court, and this is a quote from Vox, by the way, found that overcrowding in California prisons was so bad that it amounted to unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual punishment. And she's been pretty much invisible during almost all of her 4 years as vice president, so I'm not the biggest Kamala Harris fan. But what I did like at the beginning of her 2024 campaign were the constant attacks against the GOP. They had their finger on the pulse of what many people in this country think about the Republican Party at this point. These people are fucking weird. They think they have the right to dictate what you can or can't do with your own body. They want to be able to tell you who you can or can't marry. They constantly persecute against marginalized groups that they don't like. They are willing to deny reality and say, no, we actually won when election results don't go their way. Normal people don't say shit like this or hyperfixate on shit like this. And it was such a breath of fresh air at the time because we were so used to seeing Democrats be these meek morons not wanting to go on the offense against the opposition out of fear of appearing too divisive. All the while, Republicans get to walk all over them and antagonize them as much as they please. But now, unfortunately, we are seeing a grand return of the usual Democrat submissiveness. She is now palling around with Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz Cheney, which, by the way, Dick Cheney, evil piece of shit. He was Bush's VP and one of the architects of the Iraq War, one of the most shameful geopolitical failures in modern American history. We went there under the pretense of fighting terrorism and there being weapons of mass destruction when no such weapons existed. Iraq was not responsible for 9/11. The Bush administration and Congress just wanted to take advantage of this country still reeling from 9/11 to spill some Middle Eastern blood to make it look like they were doing something to combat terrorism. And Liz Cheney, when Trump was still in office, voted in agreement with him 93% of the time. They both opposed a $1.5 trillion infrastructure package. They both opposed more environmental protection against certain harmful chemicals that fuck up our environment. They both opposed restoring parts of the Voting Rights Act and expanding the Affordable Care Act. Liz Cheney is pretty much Trump just without the desire to end democracy. Here you are, agreeing with nearly every policy the wannabe dictator supports, or agreeing with him with nearly every policy he opposes, but you draw the line when he wants to install himself as president even after most of the country voted him out. So stunning. Look, obviously Kamala can't just go on the campaign trail one day and outright say, fuck the Republican Party and fuck everyone who votes for the Republican Party. As funny as that would be, I know that would be campaign suicide. But you also don't have to fully capitulate to the Republicans either. The messaging from the early days of the campaign was perfect because you made the distinction clear. When you were calling the GOP weird, everyone knew you were talking about the Trump loyalists, those in Congress, and those who would never in a million years consider voting for you. I'm so tired of Democrats constantly extending olive branches to the GOP when they don't get anywhere near the same amount of deference in return. Do you want to know what Trump is saying at this point? He wants to use the military to go after quote-unquote enemies from within. What else does that mean besides Democrat politicians, those who vote Democrat, and everyone in general who doesn't align with Trump ideologically? logically. Whether or not that would actually go through fruition is irrelevant. The fact that a major political party in this country is fronted by someone who would flagrantly say something like that is extremely concerning and something that we should not just lie down and capitulate to. I have friends who are LGBTQ+, both in real life and online, one of whom died recently, and while her death wasn't intentional, the rampant bigotry from the Republican Party almost certainly still played a part in it. These people who I am close to are people that many Republican Party officials and voters would find subhuman, just simply based on their sexual preference and or gender identity. My grandmother, on my mother's side, was an immigrant from Ecuador. Her and her husband, my grandfather, came to this country in search of better opportunities than what was provided in their home country. And that's what most immigrants who come to this country today seek. But in today's political climate, my grandmother and grandfather would be demonized and told to get the fuck out of this country because they're not white and not native to this country. So even though I'm a cis-het, seemingly white dude, when it comes to my skin color, I largely take after my father's genes. He has a mostly European background. And I live in a blue, strong, cold state, New York State, and I live in New York City on top of that. I likely wouldn't be impacted by a second Trump term. But then I think about the people I do know who are part of the marginalized groups that are constantly attacked by Trump and his supporters, and some of these people live in red states on top of that, and I think of the people in general in this country who would be directly negatively impacted by a second Trump term, and that's when I'm like, I have no fucking patience when it comes to the GOP anymore. I'm not going to slob the knobs of people who are completely okay with the extremism and bigotry the Trump years normalized within the GOP, and only drew the line when Trump wanted to reject democracy and grant himself a second term. You knew just how unhinged Trump was during his 4 years. He spent months before the 2020 election delegitimizing mail-in ballots, conditioning his base to reject the results of the election because he knew polls didn't look good for him. So when your ideology is near indistinguishable from a guy like that, just with a little caveat of not wanting to end democracy, you don't get any brownie points from me. And honestly, I wouldn't mind if every once in a while Kamala brought up Dick and Liz Cheney's endorsements just to illustrate the point that, see, even Trump's party thinks he's fucking crazy. But doing a whole fucking event with Liz Cheney and shifting your campaign message to, we can't be too mean to Republicans, is just so nauseating and shows that this party cannot be rid of Clinton-era civility politics brain rot. We are in a completely different era of politics where the Republican Party has no problem constantly demonizing their opposition, flat out saying they're gonna get the military to round up their opposition. I'm not saying match the extremism, but for fuck's sake, push back against it more, instead of being like, well, if we keep treating these people with kid gloves and be nice to them all the time, maybe they'll consider voting for us. That strategy has proven time and time again to not fucking work. People liked the aggression because the Republican Party for years has walked all over you, and then finally, you showed some teeth. But now you're back to, let's not be too aggressive towards those who would rather see you dead for your party affiliation. And look, an evil piece of shit who was one of the architects of one of the most unpopular wars in modern American history supports us. Isn't that so cool? But we'll see if this translates into more votes on election day. The only silver lining here is Trump's 2024 campaign is so polarizing that I think a lot of people in this country would rather take a moldy sandwich over him. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Bye-bye.